obviously Israel and Palestine are not the same. No situation is the same. I talk in the book also about the American South during Jim Crow and about Northern Ireland. But what I think all of these things have in common is that people come to associate supremacy with their survival, and they come to associate equality with death. And I argue that this is not actually a particular product of the Jewish experience. It's actually common for people in supremacist political systems to tend to think that it is supremacy that keeps them safe.
Hi, folks, and welcome back to In the Meanwhile. I'm Marcus Harrison Green.
And I'm Nora Kenworthy.
You know, Nora, the worst part about being a weekly show is there's just never enough news. We're just really scraping the barrel every single week.
Yeah, completely. No, the news barrel is bone dry. It's not as if the news cycle did 5 lines of Adderall every morning and woke us up in the middle of the night. Um, I think that's why all of us sleep like a baby these days, Marcus. A
Oh,
baby in
yeah.
a country with no pediatric health care, but still a baby.
Sigh. Well, the titanic levels of satanic tsunami news cycle we're wading through every week is honestly what we love about our jobs, folks.
Is it?
No, not
You're
really.
the
I'm just
journalist, so I don't
just
know.
trying to
Maybe
be
you like it.
trying to be optimistic here, I guess. I don't know. But that does bring us, Nora, to what I know all our listeners have already heard about, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the extremely not boring at all event last Saturday, which, if you've been living under a rock, was where a teacher from California named Cole Allen attempted to breach the dinner. He had firearms, a knife, let off several shots, though he did not get past security as they detained him before he even reached the floor where the dinner was being held.
Yes. And And then fairly quickly afterwards, it
Yes.
emerged that he had a very full manifesto, a
Mm-hmm.
1,000-word document that he sent to his family about 10 minutes before. Um, and I wanna say this actually carefully, because it's a somewhat ideologically complicated,
Yeah.
theologically
Yeah.
complicated statement, which is not a sentence I expected to be saying about an assassination attempt this week, but here we are.
Yeah, it was also content aside, of course. Also, seemingly very well written. I thought he might have a job at the Jacobin.
He is a
Once he,
teacher.
yeah, that is true. I that said, not all teachers are created equal. But anyway, uh, that said, I do want to say this explicitly as a disclaimer. We do, of course, abhor political violence on this show. And we're not hedging on that. Um, but what we are doing right now is diagnosing, because what we keep seeing, whether it's in warehouses being burnt down, the data center incidents, are this incident right here, is a recurring pattern that political scientists and historians will tell you has a very predictable cause.
Yes. And I think this is where it becomes less about one rogue individual and more about a broader pattern of people pulling from real moral or religious frameworks to say what is happening is not okay.
Right.
But also interpreting them without accountability, without community. uh, Clearly, I think feeling that peaceful avenues are close to them, that the law no longer provides justice, the systems are rigged, the powerful and well connected are no longer accountable to everyday people. We're not endorsing at all the outcomes of those beliefs, but I do think we have to read them as a broader temperature check on where American society is.
Yeah, and the temperature is, to use a very scientific term, extremely not fucking great.
Yeah, yeah.
So here we are.
Somewhat concerning.
Yes, to put it mildly, folks. To put it mildly, yes.
Also concerning, I think, was the fact that at least many of the Americans that I follow on social media in the immediate aftermath of this incident, about half of them seemed to be saying that they didn't think it was true, and the other half seemed to be, like, shrugging their shoulders and being like, "Well, another day in America."
Right. It was, it was either incompetence or a false flag at the end of the day,
Isn't
and
that
so
great?
here we are.
Isn't that great? Not loving it here. I will also say that the Trump administration also is not loving it here this week. They immediately tried to blame Jimmy Kimmel's expectant widow joke for inspiring violence, which is just no. Like, we all know that Melania doesn't wanna be married to him, right? Like,
That
we
is
all
very
know
obvious upon her
that.
face. Yes.
In fact, just this week, I think, she was caught on camera yet again yanking her hand out of Trump's grasp at the, event with, the king and queen.
Yeah, was that
So,
before or after he made the joke that, "I'm sorry, my dear, but we will not, I guess, stand the test of time. We will not have the 65-year marriage, I guess, that his parents had?"
but let's be clear, whatever Jimmy Kimmel said about an age gap in the presidential marriage did not cause a man to take a 60-hour train ride with firearms.
No, it did not. But just turning back quickly to the man's manifesto, it was extremely detailed and signed "Friendly Federal Assassin Allen," and it included a postscript that was essentially a Yelp review of the Secret Service's security failures. Like he wrote, and I will not quote him extensively, but the gist was he walked in with multiple weapons and could not believe nobody stopped him.
Yeah, I mean, it was really funny because he almost, like, broke out of character and came back and was like, "Hold on, I gotta say some more, like, the security really
Yes.
fits here." Um,
He was like breaking the fourth wall or something. I don't
yeah,
yeah.
and, I mean, America being, like, a general embarrassment all the time aside, I do think that this is a legitimate concern that we should be paying attention to. I mean, he's going to prison, but he's not wrong.
No, and I will say this, one other, and this is a petty thing, but hey, we're not beyond it here on the show. The one of the other revealing things about the nights at Nora, at least for me, was that several Trump cabinet members, upon hearing gunshots, fled the scene. They ran like banshees, Nora, including
Yes.
your favorite, RFK Jr., who left his wife, Cheryl Hines, behind. It was just like,
Yes. I keep watching the film from that with, like, all of them scattering, and I like, the soundtrack that runs in my head is like, bad boys, what you gonna do?" And, like, if someone could serve that up to me on social media, I'd be very appreciative.
Yeah. Well, many of these folks are already living on military bases, and I guess we see why. So
Mm,
anyhow, but getting back to our very rigged, very fragile system of democracy, Nora.
uh-huh.
So recently, our wonderful Hall of Jackals, none of the Supreme Courts, farther gutted the Voting Rights Act, and I'm talking about like they did a John Wick style thing, Nora, where it is just like the organs are just hanging out from the guts. It's just a
Yeah,
bloody, bleeding mess. I'm sorry for the vividness, but that is essentially what they did to the Voting Rights Act this week.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, even though many of us felt like it was coming, it still felt like such a blow to the gut.
Yeah,
6-3. I've heard voting rights advocates and lawyers all week calling this, one of the worst decisions of 100 years. Uh, you know, not just of the Roberts Court, certainly among Citizens United and other
right.
decisions that I think will live in infamy. Um, and I think it's important for people to really seriously grapple with what's been happening here.
No, absolutely. For those who uh, aren't quite well versed on the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Act was a provision that said you cannot draw voting districts that dilute the power, essentially, of black and brown voters, even if you claim you're not doing it on purpose. But if the effect is discriminatory, that is all that matters. And well,
Yeah.
the effect is definitely going to be discriminatory,
Yeah,
Nora.
yeah, and
So.
anyone who's looked at gerrymandering maps will immediately recognize, that this is, what's called disparate impact. You know, it doesn't matter if you say you were doing something for neutral reasons. If the result disproportionately harms a group, you shouldn't be able to do it. And the court just essentially eliminated that. Also, I side note, they eliminated it while talking about discrimination against white people. I
They are the most aggrieved class of people in this country
I
these days. I mean,
know, I know.
Lord. Yeah, so just so folks can understand this correctly, the Supreme Court of the United States has looked at decades of voter suppression, looked at Louisiana. where Black residents make up roughly a third of the state's population.
Mhm.
And the Republican legislature openly defied Section 2 to provoke a legal challenge, with the solution being we only intervene if you can catch someone saying the quiet part out loud, meaning, yeah, we are doing
Yeah.
this because we want
Openly
to.
admitting
Yeah.
racist motives, which
Yeah.
yeah.
We don't want Black
I
people to vote,
mean,
ultimately.
I honestly wouldn't put that past Republicans at this point, but it's not something that I wanna, like, have as a legal basis for the law. Um, and certainly no one's gonna be saying the quiet part out loud after this decision.
Yeah. Well, this decision it builds on Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which essentially gutted the pre-clearance provisions that were a part of the Voting Rights Act that required states with histories of discrimination that in those states happen to
They know
overlap
who
with
they
the
are.
Confederacy of.
Yeah.
But anyway, it required those states to get federal approval before changing their voting laws. And then there was a Rocho versus Common Cause in 2019, which said partisan gerrymandering is a political question federal courts can't touch.
Okay. Yeah. So in 2013, they removed the early warning system. Um, and in 2019, they said courts can't stop partisan gerrymandering. And now in 2026, they've said that you can't challenge racial gerrymandering unless people explicitly say that it was racial gerrymandering. Um,
Huh.
I mean, this does seem a little bit like a very methodical, deliberate dismantling of racial equity and voting rights, for over a decade now.
Yeah, Nora, if nothing else, I gotta respect the persistence. I mean, my God, you talk about
They
people who
had a
don't give up.
plan. Yeah,
Jeez.
yeah. They're good
And
they do
then,
that with reproductive rights too, I have a feeling.
yeah, yeah, I've heard this. I've heard this. Yeah.
Ugh, yeah. I
Uh,
heard someone say this week that a Black woman now, has less reproductive rights and less voting rights than her mother did.
Jeez, that is unfortunately like fairly accurate, which
Yeah,
is pretty galling. Louisiana has already taken the step of canceling its primaries to withdraw. Jesus Christ. Let me. And Nora, Louisiana, because of course it's Louisiana, has already taken the step of canceling its primaries to redraw its congressional maps.
which I'm sure will be conducted with great impartiality and a deep commitment to representative democracy and fairness, Marcus.
Nora, I'm going to take the opposite bet on Polymarket. Just
Yeah,
saying.
I think there might be some
Just saying.
people joining you on that one.
Oh my God.
So, I mean, here's what I think people need to understand, though. It isn't just Louisiana. It isn't just Florida. Um, if you live in Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, Alabama, those state legislatures can and probably will redraw districts before the 2026 elections. They have time. They have the will for sure. And the legal challenge path is now extremely narrow. So I'm saying right now, Marcus, I think we need another deep voting rights therapy session with Hannah Freed, who
Oh my
joined us on the
God.
podcast a while ago. We need some more of her calming talk about the upcoming
Yeah.
election.
Either that or a movement to secede from this country. But
Ugh,
anyway, to, but I'll say to sort of echo what you were saying earlier, Nora. Ashley Shelton, the CEO of Power Coalition for Equality and Justice in Louisiana, told The Guardian that after this ruling, she said that I think it is deeply troubling that in 2026, many of us have fewer rights than our grandparents had, and that becomes truer and truer every single year.
yeah, yeah. Um, Now, the voting rights advocates who are organizing right now, they're already pivoting. The fight moves to state courts, state level voting rights acts, on the ground organizing. This fight relocates, it doesn't disappear, and it needs more people now than ever.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing I want people to hold on to. Before the Voting Rights Act, there were almost no Black members of Congress. During Reconstruction, there were 22. After Reconstruction ended, that number dropped to 0.
Mhm.
We have been here before, folks, and we came back. That is a fact. I know that,
Yeah.
I know that it's dark right now, but right, it's always darkest before the dawn. Before
Yeah.
somebody said before it goes pitch black. So either one,
Yeah.
either one.
Yeah. And And I'll say this, I mean, if you're sitting there thinking this is just a black voting rights issue, I mean, we all have to reckon with the fact that the logic being deployed here, impact doesn't matter, only provable intent is the same logic being used in workplaces right now against anyone who faces systemic discrimination. I mean, I will also say, I think all of us suffer when our voting districts get more polarized. Like, our
Yes.
democracy suffers. This is actually not good for anyone's well being or health or ability to achieve a sustainable life in the United States going forward. There's just not good governing that comes out of this.
No, absolutely not. Which I think is a good seg in some ways, nor in the bleakest possible way, of course, to the fact that we should probably continue to talk about what all of this is going to produce. Because I do keep going back to something John F. Kennedy Jr. said and that Martin Luther King Jr. actually repeated. I don't know, something about all the juniors, I guess. But this was actually 5 decades ago now that he said this. He said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.
Ugh, I don't see it getting better before it gets worse, folks. I'm not gonna lie to you. This whole arc of justice thing is not very linear. But we are here for the ride.
Yes, Nor that might be the least encouraging pep talk in podcast history,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'll take it. In terms of the wisdom that we all need right now, particularly in this time and day and age, we have some for you today in the form of Peter Beinart and his new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza: A Reckoning.
That's right. We wanted Peter on because, and I want to be clear about this, because neither Marcus or I are Jewish. This book is not only a reckoning with Jewish identity in the context of the genocide of Gaza, it's a rigorous, sometimes brutal examination of how communities construct narratives that allow them to participate in oppression while believing themselves to be moral.
Yeah, which to be honest is a very universal human story. It is definitely a part of the human condition. The power dynamics at play here, the mechanisms of narrative capture, the question of whether you can truly reconcile with the past you've been taught not to see clearly, that is every community story if you look hard enough.
Right. Beinart is also interesting because he has moved publicly and on the record very far from where he started. He was once one of Israel's most prominent American defenders. He edited The New Republic. He supported the Iraq War. He has admitted to complicity in tolerating workplace sexual harassment. He is a person who has repeatedly looked at himself and said, I was wrong. I need to do better. And then actually gone through the process to do it.
Yeah, which I will say in a media landscape full of people who would rather die than admit error is pretty damn remarkable.
Yeah, it's remarkable in any landscape.
Yeah, and he is also, full disclosure, one of my partner's favorite authors. So this one is partially personal.
Noted. All right. Well, full conflict of interest disclosure from our most parasocially accountable host. We love that for you.
Well, thank you, Nora. But I'll say what I find most powerful about Von Art's argument is this: he's not asking American Jews to abandon community or solidarity. I think he's asking them to reckon with the way in which that solidarity has been weaponized in service of a state committing what he and many others, and including your co-host on this show, are calling a genocide. He says, and I think this is the heart of it, that the first people created according to the Torah are not Jews. All human beings are created in the image of God, and that precedes any story.
Yeah. And he argues that what Israel has done in Gaza is the most profound desecration of the central idea of the absolute and infinite worth of every human being. And the organized American Jewish community has responded by acting as though Palestinians in Gaza have essentially no right to claim their human value.
And he's also very honest about how long it took him to get there. He describes going to the West Bank and realizing with the shock that he had been thinking of Palestinians as an abstract group rather than as human beings. He calls that unlearning an experience of liberation. And that's what the book is really about, not just the horror, but the possibility that on the other side of reckoning, something different becomes possible.
He's described the current ceasefire as extremely fragile and probably temporary, but has also described his dream Israeli Jews and Palestinians living in full equality with genuine reconciliation, full refugee return, historical justice, as something that would, quote, unleash things that would be miraculous for people around the world.
Will he or we see it? He has no idea. But we keep coming back to this. That is a dream that is very much worth continuing to dream.
That is the dream. Let's get into the conversation.
Peter, thank you so very much for joining us today. You're both huge fans of you and huge fans of your work. Um, I want to begin today by asking, in your most recent book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, you argued that a dominant story of Jewish identity centered on persecution and victimhood is both limiting and dangerous. What does it mean for you to challenge or evolve beyond a narrative identity that many see or believe as being protective?
I think that the problem with the idea that somehow Jews have a particular historical role to be victims of anti-Semitism in a strange way is that it actually denies us our full humanity. Recognizing that
Hmm.
Jews are fully human is to recognize that Jews, like all people, can play every different role depending on the context. We are all capable of being victims and being victimizers. Um, and I think in fact, Jewish tradition itself, I try to argue in the book that it actually, even many of the holidays that are often narrated in American Jewish life as stories of victimhood and persecution are actually more complicated if you look at them, that they have other elements that actually have to do with what would look to us like Jewish acts of violence against other people. And, Jewish tradition has different ways of thinking about those, but that they're not ignored in the rabbinic tradition. And I think this has been really disastrous when it comes to Israel and Palestine. So there's this constant effort, and you saw it right after October 7th, that to describe essentially Hamas as Nazis, to describe what happened on October 7th as a pogrom, to say that it was the worst killing attack on Jews since the Holocaust, as if again there's some connection here between this and the Holocaust. What happened on October 7th were a terrible series of war crimes, but they happened, it seems to me, in a context which is fundamentally different than the context of European anti-Semitism against Jews in Tsarist Russia or in Nazi Germany. And so this by imagining that the Palestinians or even Hamas are simply the reincarnation of these previous generations of genocidal anti-Semites, either from the Bible or from secular history, we actually erase the humanity of Palestinians and we blind ourselves to certain painful but really necessary truths, which is at the heart of which is that Gaza is a population of mostly refugees. Most of the people in Gaza are not from Gaza. They're from families that were expelled from what's now Israel or fled in fear during Israel's creation. They've basically been trapped in this area from which they've been trying to get out since really 1948. And so if one thinks about this terrible act of violence on October 7th by a group of people who were forced off their land and are now living in what Human Rights Watch has called an open air prison, then we start to think about analogies that I think are actually much more useful, although more in some ways more difficult, I think, because they challenge the Jewish narrative of victimhood. That would be with, for instance, massacres by Native Americans in the United States in the 19th century who were forced off their land into smaller and smaller enclaves and sometimes broke out and did kill men, women, and children in terrible massacres. But if the story Americans told about that was, well, these people are just savages, which lays the groundwork for even more catastrophic violence. And I think the Jewish victimhood story in a way does the same thing and then has laid the predicate in some ways for the genocide that Israel committed in Gaza after October 7th.
Yeah, exactly. Peter, I want to back up a little bit and kind of help our listeners know where you're coming from as you write this book. You write in the book about being raised in South Africa, first under the apartheid regime, and then later seeing that regime transition to a more democratic one. I'm wondering how that particular upbringing shapes how you view what's going on in Israel and Palestine now.
Thanks. My parents immigrated from South Africa to the United States just before I was born, but I did spend a good
Okay.
part of my childhood there visiting our relatives. Um, Obviously, Israel and Palestine are not the same. No situation is the same. I talk in the book also about the American South during Jim Crow and about Northern Ireland. But what I think all of these things have in common is that people come to associate supremacy with their survival, and they come
Mm,
to associate equality with death. And I argue that this is not actually a particular product of the Jewish experience. It's actually common for people in supremacist political systems to tend to think that it is supremacy that keeps them safe. And I saw this logic up close, with, in my own family of white South Africans. White South Africans said, the African National Congress and other black groups are trying to violently attack us, right? And the ANC was a violent organization. It was not nonviolent. This is kind of one of the myths that Americans have peddled about Nelson Mandela.
mhm.
He actually helped to move the ANC. He helped to convince the ANC to adopt armed resistance. So they saw that the ANC was committing these acts of violence, and they said the apartheid system protects us against these people who are clearly a threat to us. And then they say, and you, naive Western liberals, you want us to give up this shield that keeps us safe and leave us at the mercy of these people who we know are trying to kill us, right? And that logic, when you're enmeshed in it, and these fears are constantly being stoked, really has a very powerful logic to it. And I try to argue in the book that we can see, if we can step back from these situations, that it misunderstand that it's a fundamental problem of cause and effect, this logic, right? The African National Congress, Mkhonto Wesizwe, the military wing, was not launching military attacks because the ANC wanted to kill white people and would take any opportunity. It was because Black South Africans had no mechanism for creating political change, for getting the government to listen to them and address their needs. So they went to take up arms, which is what groups all over the world do when they feel that they're blocked out of political power. And once apartheid ended and Black South Africans got the vote, the armed wing of the ANC was no longer necessary, just like the IRA in Northern Ireland, which had blown up all kinds of stuff, put away their weapons. And so my argument is not that everything would be perfect and easy in an Israel Palestine where Jews and Palestinians were living equally alongside one another. But my basic argument is, if Palestinians had the right to vote, all Palestinians under Israeli control, a nonviolent mechanism for the government to hear them and to express their interests and get their needs met, or at least be part of a process, then actually the likelihood of violence goes down.
Right. Well, before I ask my next question, I do want to say, but even though you do have, since you do have roots in South Africa, you are, given Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, you are definitely our favorite adjacent South African that we've ever spoken with on the show. Um, that, but that said, Peter, I want to go back to something you said about sort of when, I'm paraphrasing here, but when sort of the dominant culture is feeling a threat, and things like superiority is something that they equate with survival versus equality. And I think we're certainly seeing that now in the United
Yes.
States.
Yes.
Uh, you know, both when it comes to sort of this appetite for patriarchy as well as sort of
Yes.
racial hierarchy. But
Yes.
I want to, which is why I want to ask you. You with this book, you call for a new story, quote unquote, grounded in equality rather than supremacy. So, what, in your estimation, are the raw materials for that story, and who gets to be the author of it?
Well, I think in some ways everybody has to author it themselves or build communities that work together to author it. But I would say, for me, look, Judaism is an ancient religion which speaks in many, many voices, right? Just like Christianity or Islam,
Right.
right? So I don't want to suggest, I think everybody has to, in some ways, take from Jewish tradition, emphasize the things that speak most powerfully to them, because again, you have many, many voices that speak in different ways. But for me, the roots of the story would be the fact that Torah does not begin with a Jewish story. The first, according to Jewish tradition, the first characters that we meet in the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, or the beginning of Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, Noah, the generation of the flood, the generation of the Tower of Babel. None of these people are understood in Jewish tradition as Jews or Israelites or proto-Jews or Israelites. They're universal human beings, right? They're people essentially of no particular ethnicity or race or religion or nation. The world hasn't been divided up that way yet. And to me, the central message of that is there is a universal value to all human life. That, as Abraham Joshua Heschel said, all human beings are created equal in the image of God, and the human being is the only thing in the Bible that is created in the image of God. So before you even get to the Jewish story, and in fact, the first covenant in Torah is not between Abraham as a kind of the Jewish covenant or even the monotheistic covenant. The first covenant is with Noah, again, who's not considered to be by any rabbi, rabbinic commentator I've ever met to be a Jew. So again, to me, it seems to me the basic idea underprinting everything is the value of all human life. And so if we think about our particular connection to Israel and Palestine, a place where half of the people are Palestinian, the value of their life, the incalculable value of their life, has to be central to the way in which we think about what we want that land to be. And what has happened, I think, in mainstream establishment Jewish discourse is the state has been elevated to a kind of become more important than the lives of the people who live within that state. And that seems to me to be, again, fundamentally contrary to Judaism as I see it, right? Human beings are created in the image of God. States are not. States are just instruments, right? They have no inherent value. They have no unconditional value. Their only value is to the degree that they protect the lives and flourishing of the people who live within them. So then when people say the first question you have to answer about before you say anything about Israel-Palestine is, does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state? I quote the great Israeli Orthodox social critic Yasher Halevovitz, who says, absolutely not, right? No state has an inherent right to exist. States must always be judged based on how they treat the people who live within them. And if the states are not protecting human life but destroying it, you have an obligation to reimagine the state so it can do a better job of honoring the image of God within all the people who live within that state.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the most powerful arguments of the book is in when you're writing that Jewish and Palestinian safety then are deeply intertwined rather than oppositional. I think that's a really profound reframing, especially for a lot of Jews who have kind of inherited this narrative of unsafety, right? Um, so what does that look like in real terms to reckon with the idea that Jewish and Palestinian safety are intertwined and also to govern that way?
I mean, I think first of all, it could help us understand that what Israel has done in Gaza, beyond being profoundly immoral, I think ultimately actually may create the patina of safety for Jews, but I actually think in the longer term makes Israeli Jews radically less safe. I mean, I mentioned in my book that Israel has been invading into Gaza really since the early 1950s, because again, people were expelled there in 1948 and they've been trying to return ever since, right? And so as they've tried to return, oftentimes unarmed, just to go back to their fields a little bit, sometimes also armed, Israel then attacks. And we've been in this cycle really ever since. And so some of the leaders of Hamas and Islamic Jihad are literally the children of people who Israel killed in a massacre when it invaded Gaza in 1956, right? A massacre of a couple hundred people. So now think about what has happened now. Israel has killed perhaps 100,000 people in Gaza. It's not even mentioned the number of people who've been injured, right? Every single person in Gaza has seen probably dozens of family members killed, people starving to death, people not being able to get adequate medical attention. What do we think the next generation of Palestinians is likely to do given that experience, right? Israel says, no, we don't like Hamas. We want the Palestinians to create a more moderate political force. Are those conditions that are likely to create a more moderate political force, right? It's almost childlike, right? But there is an interaction between the way you treat people and the way they treat you. And I try to argue in the book that even if we think about acts of Palestinian violence against Israel since the 1990s, we can see how in some ways they respond to the possibilities that Palestinians feel, the hope they feel, that they are actually moving towards freedom, that there's less violence when there is more hope that Palestinians are actually moving towards no longer being basically colonial subjects of a state in which they have no rights. So that's the base. That would be my kind of basic understanding. And I argue in the book that you can see that even within Israel, Israeli Jews understand this at some level because 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinians. It kind of gets masked because people often call them Arab Israelis, but they're just the Palestinians who managed to not get expelled, right? And one of the things that many of the Israeli Jews who would be very afraid to go into Gaza without a gun or go to the West Bank, go into hospitals where many of the doctors and nurses and pharmacists are Palestinian citizens of Israel. They're literally on the operating table. There's a person with like a knife or a sharp object who's Palestinian while they're like, why are they not terrified of those people? They're also Palestinian. They also don't like Zionism very much, right? But the point I'm arguing is that because those people have some rights, they're not equal, but some basic rights, it actually means that they're less likely to take up violence because they have some other opportunities for creating a better life for themselves. And Israeli Jews at some level understand that, and that relationship between their rights and the fact that they're less of a threat.
Yeah. Peter, I gotta just also just personally thank you for writing the book. Um our listeners know that my partner is Jewish, and a few months ago, uh, her family descended upon our home for my stepson's bar mitzvah, and let's just say there were a variety of opinions about the post October 7th world, and conversations, quite frankly, that I didn't feel it was my place to engage in um, as these sort of tense moments were happening. And one of the things that one of the conversations that were paramount, I'll say, is sort of this conflation of equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and then equating Israel's actions with Jewish identity itself.
Right.
And that's a distinction that, I mean, as an outside looking in, that I thought it was fairly obvious to delineate. However,
Yes. Yes.
it appears that it continues to be hard to do so in public discourse, and I want
Yes.
to ask you why that is.
Well, I think for really close to 50 years now, really in the wake of the 1967 war, there's been an effort by the Israeli government, but also by American Jewish institutions, essentially to put Israel at the center of American Jewish identity. I think in some ways it's filled a void that has been left by the fact that most American Jews have a pretty tenuous relationship with Judaism itself. And the hard work of, it's not an easy religion. It's first of all, Judaism takes place in a foreign language, generally, actually multiple foreign languages, and much of it can seem arcane. And I think in a way, what has taken place instead is this confluence of the story of the Holocaust in Israel. That basically, Israel is the protection against another Holocaust, against the Jews in Israel, and the roles of American Jews is to ensure that doesn't happen. That Israel can keep that the Jews in Israel don't suffer Holocaust. That Israel is there so we don't suffer another Holocaust. And I think this conflation, as you say, of Israel and it's clear that certainly what we call the land of Israel, right? What in Jewish texts called Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is central in the way in many Jewish religious texts. But the land is separate from the state. If the land has a certain sanctity in Judaism because there are certain commandments that can only be fulfilled there, that sanctity is there whether it's under the Ottoman Empire or the British Mandate or whoever. It's not about the state that was created in 1948, right? And obviously, it's also understandable that Jews may feel a sense of obligation to other Jews, and almost half the Jews in the world live in Israel. But again, this is about people and land. It's not about the state. The problem with saying that to be a good Jew is to support the state of Israel, and that to oppose Israel is to be anti-Jewish, is states are self-interested creatures, right? And they must always be subject to criticism. And it makes as little sense to say that that it's anti-Semitic to question Israel or question Israel's political system, to question Zionism, as it does to say it's you're anti-Chinese, you're bigot against Chinese Americans if you say, I don't really like the People's Republic of China. I think they should overthrow the Chinese Communist Party and have a multi-party democracy, right? Or that it's not anti-Muslim to say, I really don't like the political systems in Iran or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, right? We all kind of this should be, as you say, this should be pretty clear, but I think it's not clear because there's been an effort that's been made for a very, very long time to conflate these things too. And it's not just analytically wrong, it's actually quite dangerous, right? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't say, I mean, the problem is if you say that to be Jewish is to support the state of Israel, that the two things are basically inextricably intertwined, then you're basically telling people who don't like the state of Israel, who have some hostility to the state of Israel, perhaps for very good reason, given what Israel's doing, that they then should actually, that hostility should also be a hostility to Jews, right? We need to keep these things separate analytically because they are separate, but also because actually Jewish safety requires that we keep them separate.
I really appreciate you saying that. It's a fraught conversation that we've been having at my university, the University of Washington, for a while now. All of us were forced to do this mandatory civil rights training in which we were told that critiquing Zionism is being anti-Semitic, and many of my Jewish colleagues were very upset by that. And making exactly the point that you're making, that it renders all of us less safe to have those two be conflated. I want to give you an opportunity to also, though, speak to another kind of emerging conflation that's happening right now. You had a recent essay in the New York Times in which you warned about rising right wing critiques of Israel that really have their roots in sort of true anti Semitism or condemnation of Jewishness rather than state power. How do you want people to recognize and confront that critique and its dangers as well?
Yeah, the point that I was making, again, not that all people who are politically conservative who criticize Israel are anti-Semitic. I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I was arguing is that if you look at some of the most prominent anti-Israel critics on the right now, Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, and in a somewhat more subtle way, but still I think significantly, Tucker Carlson, what you see is a desire to criticize Israel, a very legitimate desire. Some of the things that Tucker Carlson says about Israel, I think, are absolutely right, and the things he says about the war in Iran. But the problem is, I think he's trying to criticize Israel while maintaining a kind of certain notion of Western Christian moral superiority. So as opposed to seeing Israel as a country that's doing many of the same terrible things that have been done by many countries around the world, including our own, right? Which was also a settler colony that was created by dispossessing other people. He has a tendency to talk about Israel as through the lens of its Jewishness, that it is anti-Western, that it is anti-Christian, that in some ways it is trying to subvert America and Europe and the West. And I think that framework is dangerous. I think part of the problem is that the pro-Israel Jewish organizations are making the same conflation, but Carlson making it, I think, is quite disturbing, and I think that it is a way, to me, it seems to me he is trying to find a way of being critical of Israel, which doesn't actually take a universalistic frame that sees Israel as, that recognizes that Israel is part of a system of violence and oppression that the United States is also very much a part of. And that his unwillingness to recognize that leads him to focus on Israel as having some kind of particularly Jewish pathology. And that's what worries me.
Yeah, and Peter, at the risk of, I guess, sounding like a both sidesism centrist, I do want to just ask you, because I've certainly encountered it in independent media, being a journalist, that while there are times where there's independent media that I feel isn't doing uh, doing what they're doing in good faith, that occasionally they slip into anti-Semitic tropes. And so I want to ask you, how do we build a coalition with folks, whether it's independent media, whether it is people who are, again, trying to be on the right side of this issue, but just maybe don't have a knowledge base if you will, of um, of sort of historic anti-Semitic tropes or what have you that don't ignore that type of thing and make space for corrective, but also doesn't excuse that type of behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should give people the benefit of the doubt. And if people say something that we feel like may be playing into some stereotype that has historically been harmful, that's having to do with Jews and money, or Jews and kind of hidden shadowy power over the economy or the banks or the media or whatever, I think it's worth talking to people about it. And I think the answer is generally just to be more specific, right? So if somebody says that the Jews control Congress, I think that's problematic. Even if someone says the Zionists control Congress, I think that's overly broad and not a very helpful way of thinking. But if you want to say AIPAC, this particular pro-Israel organization, has given all of this amount of money, and we all know that that money shapes how members of Congress act and push, then of course that's entirely legitimate, right? And so I just think that oftentimes the answer is to try to avoid really sweeping generalizations, and focus in on the particular people that you were talking about, the particular organizations you're talking about, rather than kind of generalizing. And I think I'm wary. I think there are conspiracies that happen in the world, right? There can be, people can do nefarious plots and stuff, but I just think that if one wants to suggest that, one should actually have evidence for it. I'm not a fan of basically just kind of throwing things out there. So I hear people say, now I hear people, sometimes I literally hear people saying that they think Israel was behind the assassination of Charlie Kirk, that Israel was behind the assassination of the attempted assassination during the campaign of Donald Trump, even the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, I can't say for sure that's not true, but I would just say, before you throw out this kind of thing, like, I would like to actually see the evidence, right? And I think that there's a way that some people, and again, I mentioned Carlson and Owens and others, have a tendency to kind of traffic in these things, with in ways that I think are not helpful and even dangerous, because again, there's a kind of a there's not a careful argument being made on based evidence. It's basically like, well, maybe there's this kind of global conspiracy that has Israel behind it and is responsible for virtually everything.
Right. Into the vast vat of conspiracy theories that we all live in these days. um, I was really moved by your dedication of the book to your grandmother. You write that, I think you say, she disagreed with the arguments in this book, and her spirit is on every page. And I have a partner who's Jewish. I've watched him struggle through a lot of hard conversations and hard positions across his family on this issue. I think one of the most powerful parts of this book is that you really do write it for Jews, and to your own kind of kin. Um, and I guess I wonder if you can speak to the ways that this book emerges from a tradition and embraces a tradition in Judaism of disagreement and debate, that it feels like we've kind of lost the generous spirit of that in the last few years.
Yeah, I also start at the beginning of the book. I kind of have a note I write to a former friend, and one of the things I do in that note is try to look for different models in Jewish tradition about how people who profoundly disagree can still have a relationship with one another. And I quote this story of this relationship between someone named Elisha ben Abuya, and this figure named Rabbi Meir. This is from the Talmud. The Talmud is really a vast compendium of kind of discussions of rabbis arguing with one another, and often not really reaching a resolution. One of the things that you often find in Talmud is there'll be some long argument, and then the answer will be what they call teku, which is basically, we leave it until the Messiah comes to figure it out, basically. And Elisha ben Abuya is this famous heretic, someone who was a brilliant student, but completely rejects Judaism, doesn't observe Jewish law at all. And yet Rabbi Meir maintains this relationship with him, even despite the fact that he's a pariah, he's a heretic. And to me, that was a very powerful model for me about trying to think about people who see me as a pariah, as a heretic, and also people for whom I believe are espousing things that I believe are profoundly morally wrong. I think that there's a way in which I think it's really crucial to try to keep lines of conversation open, and to have a kind of generous spirit. And I try to remind, one of the things that I'm so great, many things I'm so grateful to about my grandmother. My grandmother had a very different political perspective than I do, right? And one of the things that I noticed about her, her entire life, was that she was if you she often acted in her own interpersonal relationships in ways that would seem to me quite out of step with her political views, which is, I think people are complicated, right? People can have political views about all kinds of things, but oftentimes the full moral totality of someone is far more than just what particular political position they take. It has a lot to do with how they act in their everyday life. And I just think we need to be we can passionately oppose people's views and say what we believe is right and wrong, but I just think we have to be careful about condemning individuals as if we know the totality of them just because they have views that we personally think are wrong. And that was something that, for me, I learned watching my grandmother, um, and I also saw that she was motivated by a deep sense of solidarity with other Jews. And I wanted to try in this book, I don't know if I succeeded, I wanted to try the book to make the claim that it's possible to believe passionately in Palestinian freedom and Palestinian equality and still feel like one's acting in solidarity with other Jews.
Uh, it- I gotta say, Peter, this conversation reminds me so much of what I call her my mother-in-law always says. She's like the greatest wisdom is always just paraphrased from Jewish texts and Jewish people. So it's not to paint too much with a broad brush. I know you said not to do that. No, but I do want to ask you there. I mean, within again, I know the black community, like the Jewish community, is not a monolith. However, I know sort of across communities there can be a reticence to sort of share your issues or problems within about the community within mixed company, so to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah.
Did did you ever for you, was there ever any hesitancy to write this book because of that? Was there did you were you ever sort of was there a bit of a trepidation of like, okay, I'm gonna put this out here, and then when it's out here, it's just out here. I don't get I can't control the response to it.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard people say that to me before. I mean, I sometimes respond that, even if I spent my entire life writing about Jews behaving badly, I would still never come anywhere close to the Hebrew Bible itself as a compendium of Jews or Israelites behaving badly. Like, our tradition actually, it's one of the things I think is powerful about the Hebrew Bible, is it actually depicts these figures as very human and often as having committing terrible sins, and that, so there's a way in which I actually think our tradition historically has been very open about
Mm,
discussing these human failings. I also think that, I start from the assumption that all Americans have the right to have an opinion about this subject. Israel is bombing Gaza with our tax dollars. Every person has the right to care about that and to think, you know what, I think our government could use those tax dollars more wisely. And beyond that, I think every human being has the right to have moral perspectives about things, you know, even if it's not their ethnic or racial or religious group that's involved. I mean, I actually think, in a way, people sometimes say, "Oh, they don't have any skin in the game." Like, to me,
mm,
when I meet Americans who have no personal connection to Israel Palestine, but who are moved to act because of some basic human solidarity with people whose culture they don't know a lot about, I actually think in some ways it's the most deeply admirable. I mentioned Heschel, so Heschel was a Polish chassid. He came to the United States. He couldn't have been more culturally far away from Vietnam than like almost anyone in the world, right? What did he know from Vietnam, right? But when he saw what America was doing in Vietnam, he was so upset by what he saw that he literally said that he couldn't open the prayer book, the Siddur, the prayer book, and pray, because he saw these images of children being napalmed in front of him. Like, that to me is actually like a form of human solidarity across lines of religion, race, ethnicity, whatever, that I think is really, really precious. And so I guess the message is, in some ways, it's a book written for Jews, but I also want to I also, one of the things I really want to, I try to say to non-Jewish audiences is that I think there's something really, really beautiful about those group of Americans who are willing to put themselves in the line out of a sense of human solidarity. And the people who I see, not, no movement is perfect. There are sometimes things, people who say at some marches that I wouldn't agree with. My basic sense of the people who care about what's happening with Palestinians is they're the same kind of people who would have been involved in previous generations in the anti-apartheid movement and the anti-Vietnam and the civil rights movement, and even going back to the abolitionist movement. Like, they're people who actually have a sense of justice that really speaks to them in a way that allows them to be willing to take risks and put and get move. And I think that's something that's really beautiful.
Yeah, it's I mean, I know it's a writing trope, right? But it when folks say that the specific equates to the universal, and I think
Yes.
that is so, so true of this book.
Yes.
Like when folks who have asked me, well, why should I pick this up? I'm not
Yeah.
Jewish, or maybe I only sort of tangentially even care about what's
Yes.
going on. It is I think it's required reading, quite frankly. So
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that.
I have so many more questions I want to ask you. I realize we're running quickly out of time. Um, one of the really persistent themes of this book is about how intergenerational trauma gets
Mhm.
processed, right?
Mhm.
And what it is used to justify and what sorts of
Mhm.
narratives it creates. Um, and I guess I'm wondering, we are also living through a time period of profound trauma for
Yeah.
lots of different groups of people.
Yes.
How would you like to see future generations transform narratives of trauma or remake them so that these types of harms from trauma don't get repeated and recreated?
It's a really great question. I mean, I think so much of this has to do with what story you tell about something. I mean, it's really remarkable. Like, you can look at different Holocaust survivors, right? Some people during the Holocaust lost their faith in God. Some people went through exactly the same experience and became more deeply devoted to God. Similarly, there are lots of people for whom the lesson they learned from their parents or grandparents who went through the Holocaust or other forms of anti-Semitism was essentially, the world is a very, very brutal place, and you either protect yourself, in this case with a Jewish army, or else you're thrown to the wolves. But it's also true that many of the most fanatical critics of Israel. Not, I mean, fanatical has a negative connotation, but I mean, like, most deeply, deeply devoted, are also from Holocaust survivor families. I mean, the great Israeli journalist Amir Haas, who lost almost everyone in her family in the Holocaust, the researcher Sarah Roy, Norman Finkelstein. I mean, these are people for whom the lesson of what their parents went through was told in a different way. The lesson was basically, um, evil things happen in the world because people sit by and don't do anything, and it doesn't, and that's a universal story. So if you're on the other side of that barbed wire, you need to be doing the kind of thing that Jews wish other people had been doing during World War II. And I think it all depends on what story you tell. And I think that part of the problem with the discussion about Jewish history and anti-Semitism, I think, is that it has become very exceptionalized, right? And, to me, obviously, every group experiences a particular kind of trauma, a particular kind of bigotry. But I think we really should emphasize the commonalities here. And I think what's happening in America today is that people say anti-Semitism is rising. Sure, anti-Semitism is rising. So is Islamophobia. So is anti-LGBT bigotry. So is anti-Black racism. So is nativism. All of these things are rising because we have forces that basically want to make America great again. And what they mean by that is they want to return America to a time when, everyone knew that white, straight Christian men were on top and everybody else was kind of slotted in underneath that everyone else is a kind of a guest in this country, right? And they better know their place, right? And, like, I think you can't fight against those forces alone. You can't make a separate peace with them and say, okay, yeah, fine. They can say whatever they want about the Somalis and the Haitians, but we're going to we're going to use our influence to make sure we're good with them. No, it doesn't work that way. I mean, if people are bigoted against Haitians and trans people and Somalis, they'll get around to Jews sooner or later. You're much better off allying and trying to put yourself out there to support those people who are on the front lines now. And then I think they will be very good allies to you if when you're in danger. And I think that unfortunately is not the way that America's most powerful Jewish organizations are responding in the Trump era.
Yeah, I want to ask Peter because it does seem at this particular point in time, right? We're seeing sort of the tension of this debate within the Jewish community in real time. I mean, my partner will say that it's been going on in time since time immemorial. But that being said, we're also seeing though at the same time there's the fracturing within our country. There's polarization and so forth. And so I guess I want to ask you is, and I'm asking you to do a little future gazing, but what do you think that we'll be able to learn sort of universally about reconciliation, hopefully from the Jewish community as they go through this process?
Well, I think I think true reconciliation needs to come from honestly facing the past. I mean, otherwise there can be there's a danger that reconciliation between some people comes at the cost of others. I think about the way the
Mm,
United States did achieve a kind of reconciliation after the Civil War, right? But that reconciliation was really built on the North and the South coming together and accepting that Black people would basically be subjugated and be pushed back into a situation of near servitude for another 100 years, right? That basically the North withdrew its soldiers from the South reimpositioned with incredible amount of violence, white supremacy, and then basically the North and the South said, okay, we can come together again. So I think a true reconciliation has to come from actually facing and reckoning in some way with the harsh truths of a country's history. And that's
mm,
something that the United States is very reluctant to do, really very reluctant to do. I mean, we saw how ferocious the backlash has been just in the last few years to the efforts to do that when it comes to slavery, for instance. And when it comes to Native Americans, I see very, very little evidence that Americans are interested in that reckoning at all. I mean, like, even a land acknowledgement in the United States, which I don't want to say like Canada and Australia and New Zealand are like paragons, but there, like, that's a pretty normal. Even here, even a land acknowledgement, even saying like, okay, yeah, we stole the land, like, that's considered like super woke, radical,
right.
like roll your eyes stuff. Like, let alone actually like trying to think about how to repair harm, to like really go through that process. And so I think one of the reasons that we as Americans I think one of the reasons that Americans have historically found the Palestinian cause very threatening, particularly white Americans have found the Palestinian cause threatening with its anti-settler colonial language, right, is in some ways because our story and this Israeli story are so similar. It's kind of like a promised land forged on a native frontier. It's just we were much more successful in destroying the native population than Israel has so far. And so I think the Palestinian cause stirs up a lot of uncomfortable things particularly for white Americans about what does it mean that we're on stolen land? How does that make us feel about ourselves, right? We like to pat ourselves on the back and not think about those things. So I think we have a huge amount of work to do here on that front.
Yes, 100%. Um, so the book is titled Being Jewish After the
Mm.
Destruction of Gaza. Gaza is still here. It is very destroyed. I'm wondering why this choice of words, and I'm also wondering about if I can ask you about the sort of like after of this book, right?
Of
Like,
course.
what has it been like for you to be Jewish after the publication of this book and to receive the kinds of reception that this book has received?
I mean, there have been difficult moments, certainly. I'm not a popular person in certain parts of the Jewish community, and that affects the way I go through the world, and to some degree the way my family goes through the world. But I've also been very, very grateful that I think I've had the opportunity to develop much deeper set of relationships with Palestinians, from whom, and I feel like, and not just Palestinians, I feel like, although in some ways my tradition, if some ways my community has been fractured or undermined a little bit, I also feel like there's a kind of new kind of moral community that I've been able to have more access to. And many of those people, many of the people in it are Palestinians. Many of them come from all just different walks of life, who and people who I really find really deeply inspiring because of their commitment to principles that are important to me. And I also have been privileged to kind of have a bit of a front row seat at, I think, a kind of moral and even spiritual awakening that is happening among young American Jews. There is a tremendous, I think, effort to challenge the kind of moral corruption that exists in the Jewish community. And I see how that's playing itself out. And it does give me a hope that actually we will start to build institutions that I think are more centered on the idea of the universal value of all human life than our current Jewish institutions are.
Well, our moral community here in Seattle is certainly excited to welcome you here when you visit Town Hall. I think
Thank you.
it's May 18th.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, well, please pack the place, everyone.
Yeah.
Peter, that
Thank
being
you.
said, tremendous, tremendous work. Thank you. It is, I know I shouldn't say this, but it has helped my personal family unit. So
Oh,
Great.
if it only sold 5 copies, it would have been well
um,
worth writing. So thank
I
you.
really appreciate that. I'm really glad to do that.
Thank you so much for joining
Thank you
us
so
today.
much. Lovely to meet you.
Well, no, I know that we are running a little long on time, and so we'll just leave folks with our conversation with Peter to process because there is a lot there that I think that they should process and hopefully take with them and hopefully excavate some of their own beliefs and some of the and interrogate some of the stories that they've heard or told about themselves and their community and also our society.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we leave it there and take up our 8 ounces of joy?
We shall. I need to drink some joy this week, shall we say?
Mm.
Yeah. Well, I'll go ahead and go first, Nora. Like I think mine is a fairly simple thing, but at the same time, it was kind of profound. So I was at our local PCC, which for those who don't know is a sort of co-op grocery store here in Seattle, and outside of it, there's a lady who it must have been the last year and a half. She stands in the near the entrance of the parking lot with her sign, asking for any financial help that anybody can do. And for the very first time, I saw, as I'm eating outside, I saw somebody pass by and actually interact with her and say, hey, Cheryl, don't, joking with her, saying, hey, Cheryl, don't take up all that shade, underneath the sun, and, talking, to her like whom she is, an actual human being. And I'll say that this conversation with Peter actually gave me additional insight into that in some ways, in the sense of, this is somebody, particularly the conversations that we have around folks who are unhoused, not just in this city of Seattle, but pretty much everywhere, where we sort of treat them as sort of scabs, if you will, of the larger our larger communities where they aren't a part of the community, or they're not viewed as part of our community. They're sort of they're viewed as somehow a burden on it or an albatross, and it's like it just made me really I'll say just kind of the conversation we had with Peter, along with seeing that interaction, it made me just interrogate even some of the things that I think I've absorbed, maybe secondhand, of about other folks who are within our community who deserve to be treated as members of our community.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I'm really glad to hear that that's still happening on the streets of Seattle because sometimes it really feels like it's not. Oh boy. Um,
Absolutely.
well, Marcus, I rushed into our conversation today from a really remarkable event that I got to attend with Kianga Yamada Taylor earlier today. She was on our campus talking to students, famed historian, New York Times columnist, um, and um, one of our students stood up in the middle of the Q&A and just asked one of the most honest and heartfelt questions that I've ever heard a student ask, and he said, "I'm working towards my degree, and I'm just wondering kind of like, what's the point? Like,
Yeah.
am I supposed to just graduate and get a job in this world, like, in this time?" And, the whole place just kind of went quiet for a second, and I think everyone just, like, had this deep empathy for this student, because it's all of us
Mm,
right now, this question of, like, are
yeah.
we really supposed to be just, like, doing normal life right now? Are we really have to show up for jobs today? Um, and she had the greatest answer for him, which I think has been a theme of our conversations over the past year so many times, which is we're not here to be professional activists. Like, that's not our
Mm,
job. We are not full-time protesters or movement workers, or um, many of us are not even full-time community organizers. Our job is to just keep on showing up in the ways that we know how to show up, and it doesn't have to be a full-time thing. And there was just a this gentleness with which she responded to this student, and just kind of reminded everyone in the audience of, like, what our job is right now. And our job is to keep showing up in whatever way we can, with whatever capacities we can, given late capitalism being as awful as it is.
yeah.
Um, and I just props to anyone who can answer a student question like that these days, because I sure can't. And I'm just so glad to see students still standing up and asking those questions too.
Absolutely. I know we maybe to put too much of a delegation of hope into the youth, but it's good to hear that some youth are still doing their thing as well. So
Yeah, yeah.
anyhow, well, with that, shall we sign off for today?
We'd better. Folks, the Republic is still standing, kind of, a little tilty maybe, maybe like it stood up too fast and is waiting for the room to stop spinning, but we will take upright.
Yes.
If you'd like to support the show and help us continue staying upright ourselves, continue turning existential angst into something you can listen to while sitting in traffic, please head to inthemeanwhilepodcast.com. Your contributions help keep this whole processing the collapse out loud operation running.
Yes, and huge thanks to Peter Beinart for joining us with the kind of historical clarity that makes you realize the present isn't unprecedented, it's just poorly remembered.
Hmm.
He basically walked in, dimmed the lights, and said, "Let me show you the prequel you've been pretending not to watch."
And shout out, as always, to our producer, Jessica Partnow, who takes our completely scatterbrained conversations and somehow edits them into a show that suggests we've slept, read, hydrated, maybe even touched grass recently.
She is a maestro, let me tell you. Also, big shout out to Aham Maluo for music so good it tricks people into thinking what follows is a well adjusted discussion instead of two people politely screaming about democracy.
You can catch In the Meanwhile Wednesdays at 5 on KVRU or wherever you stream podcasts, while opening one tab for news, one tab for snacks, one tab for should I move to another country.
New episodes drop every Friday. Until then, please do hydrate, stretch, and maybe don't get all your emotional regulation from push notifications.
And remember, if everything feels overwhelming, that's because it is. You're still here, which is annoyingly resilient of you. We love that for you.
We do respect it, yes.
Take care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you in the meanwhile.